Morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly talk this morning about how digital technologies has sort of helped us use oral history in terms of creating a collection, but also in terms of creating engagement with sort of various local groups throughout Dundee City. We think oral history has been particularly responsive in terms of the changing technologies over the last few years. So many people can go out with a small machine, with their phone even, and record somebody talking. However, oral history itself has been embedded for many years in many archives and has been seen as a useful means of expanding the scopes of the collections that exist. They're useful in offering alternative formats of evidence and also very useful in offering more intimate views of events and trends. Like many archives, Dundee University Archive already had quite a few recordings as part of their collections, but like other archives, not many of them had ever been used before. So about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a decision to be a bit more proactive and use the technology to start actually collecting testimonies. Dundee University Archive itself has a broad scope of existing collections. We have, of course, university records. We're also the Tayside Health Board repository, so we have lots of records of hospitals and asylums. We have what we could call community collections, businesses, clubs and organisations and individuals, all these kinds of collections. For example, we have the largest collection of textile records in Europe, which is not particularly surprising given that jute in particular was fundamental to the development of Dundee, to its economic development, to its physical development, to employment, to health, leisure. However, despite this huge amount of business collections, there's actually very little evidence of the actual women who worked on the floor of the mills and factories in jute and other textiles. So oral history effectively is one opportunity to fill that gap, at least post the Second World War. So the talk today by myself and by Caroline, my colleague, is how that proactivity developed from being a collective oral history project to using those testimonies to promote engagement and participation with community groups. Hopefully we'll raise a few issues that we might be able to discuss in the questions afterwards about the practice and value of oral history and sort of technological questions. Issues of recording and use and the value of testimony to researchers, to the archive and also to the participants.
Well, you obviously started school probably just after the war.
Mm-hmm. Just when we were finishing. I was about 4.5 because you got in at Christmas, you see. Well, I was 4 in November, so I got in before the next half.
In at Christmas, were the teachers very strict?
Oh, yes. I hated school. I detested school because we wore clothes. We didn't have shoes. I could still hear that teacher shouting, "Here comes, my own name's Mackenzie." I should just shout at us because we made the noise on the floor. Yes, I didn't like school. If there was a pillar and I could hide behind it, I could. So that way, I was never clever. My mum wasn't clever. My mum went in the mills at 12.
Oh dear.
She left because the First World War started, so she left and she went into the mills. And so she wasn't educated either.
No, and I mean, obviously, survival was the most important thing.
Of course.
But were there any of your contemporaries who went on to other education, or did all the children round about where you lived, did they all end up in the mills?
They all went up in the mills. Either the mills, some went to Keelis, which was better than the mills. Some went to Keelis for the sweets, but the majority went to mills. Because you grew up with the mills. Mm-hmm. Everybody spoke about the mills. And there were spinners, there were winders, but I never saw in the mills. You never saw what the jobs were. So when you come of age to go into the mills, That was an education.
Bit of a culture
Wow.
shock, I bet.
The noise and the smell and people all yapping, trying to yap, and you can't hear.
Could you understand that? Could you hear that? That's wonderful. That's Lily Thompson talking about her education and starting in the jute industry, the expectations. And it's an example of one strand of the Dundee Oral History project that we've begun, that whose remit is to supplement and add value to the existing collections, to add value by filling the gaps of the non or underrepresented, and that clip there from Lily is a perfect example of that. Okay. We've got a broad collection range within the university itself, so we also have a broad collection of participants to choose from university staff, from alumni and employees of the main industry, and in more sort of recreational collections that we sort of talk to people about. Our interviewers, we use Rhoda Miller, who has been trained by the Oral History Society. She's freelance. She was very keen to do this kind of project. She has lots of local knowledge and lots of connections in the local area, which complement that connections and knowledge of the archive staff. And as an interviewer, she is an ambassador for the project and for the archive. We also have another interviewer that has just started with us, Sharon Kelly. She is slightly younger than Rhoda, and she has a different range, a different pool of potential connections and local knowledge. We've discovered lots of things over the collecting process of, we've got over 60 recordings now, and they complement each other as well as complementing the existing collections that we have. The interview structures are very consistent, so they produce common threads of childhood, education, of work, which offer fresh sources of evidence to the researcher. And I'm not just talking about the academic researcher here. When I say researcher, I mean anybody who wants to use the archives. We've got one interview here, Alistair there, can offer insights across various areas. So Alistair, he's the owner of Groucho's, which is a local record and music shop. And his testimony talks about the local music scene, but also the national developments, also talks about change in the city itself, particularly through the 70s and the 80s. And Dr. Bethel there, who's an academic, who's a retired academic with the university, he also talks about his recreational activities with the Grampian Club. So immediately the project offers immediate positives. It gives us complementary material. It gives the staff a greater understanding of the collections we hold, and we have new sources of evidence there. The participants themselves actually are valued to be asked to be part of the project, and it's a positive experience for them, and they become, like our interviewees, become ambassadors to new communities. But the key aim of the Dundee Oral History Project was to engage with communities, not to be a static vault. And so we've gone sort of various options that we have. In one way, we've expanded the project itself to take on younger people like Hayley there. Hayley is a graduate of Dundee Art College. She's a single mum of twins, but she's also an ambassador for Dundee City because she's an award-winning fashion designer whose clothes are worn by models like Erin O'Connor and pop stars like Jessie J. Her testimony and others like hers offer views of contemporary events. It's not a case of retirees remembering over a lifetime. And hopefully this kind of interview will have more relevance to a younger audience, and it'll be something that we can go back to, our successors in the archive can go back to in 10 or 20 years. We also have projects with other sister projects like with the museums. Jim Petrie there, he was responsible for the Minx cartoon. When there was a Minnie the Minx exhibition on, they were able to use his testimony that we'd recorded. And of course, we go from the sort of static out there online, so we're in the website area, but there are limitations with that. We use social media to sort of tell people about the recordings that are sitting on our web pages, but as you can see from that, it's quite clumsy. There are technology limitations in terms of the templates of the websites, what tools we can use on the websites. So I'm going to finish just now by what we feel is the best way to engage, and that's actually to have an event where people are invited along to an evening. They can listen to the testimonies, they can talk to some of the people who we're going to sort of play back along with others that are going to talk about the jute industry. This is going to be Talking Textiles, is the first in a series of themed events, so this is obviously about textiles. And hopefully this is going to happen next week. So we can't tell you how successful that has been. But I think the intimacy that you get from an oral history recording is going to be better reflected in an event like this rather than going out there via the websites or social media. And I'll just pass on to Caroline.
Right, so I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about an oral history project that we've been involved in that I think is a good example of some of the opportunities and some of the issues that are raised by oral history, and something that couldn't have happened if it weren't for the digital environment. So at Dundee, we have the records of Strathmartin Hospital, which started life as Beldovan Asylum for Imbecile Children in the 1850s. It was actually the first hospital of its kind in Scotland and one of the first in the world. It continued caring for people with learning disabilities, children and adults, until its closure in 2003, when people were sent into the community to be cared in the community. It was a heritage lottery fund with a charity called the Theatre Trust. We were in partnership. And at the core of this project was to do interviewing of staff and former residents who'd been at the hospital. And there were lots of other outcomes from it that I'll mention later on. But from the point of view of the archives, it was a real opportunity not only to supplement our traditional collections, as Jan's been talking about, but it gave a voice to people who weren't hitherto represented in the collections. And by actively seeking to record their experiences, these people were able to discuss their memories, and this created a stronger sense of identity amongst what is now quite a disparate group of people. And I think we played a real role in empowering parts of the community and connecting them with their past. We also created new partnerships. Part of the project was to work with social workers and medical staff, both academics and practitioners, to create learning tools so that in future caseworkers could learn from the issues that had happened in the past. And also it began a process of reconciliation in the community, which I'll talk about that in a minute. The archives weren't the only part of this project, but they did play an important role, both in terms of being able to publicise the project as a prompt for people to share their memories, and also a way of involving staff and patients, residents, former residents. On the left here, you see Christopher, who came to the archives frequently and who used some of the archive images in a newsletter about the project. And on the right is our resident film buff, Bobby, who, as part of the project, he was on the steering group for the project, and he created a film about the history of Strathmartin using some of the archive collections that I'll show you just now.
DVD of the history of Strathmartin Hospital, and this is where all filmed it in, the archives in Dundee. And look at that, amazing, isn't it?
So I don't know what the rather ominous music tells you about what you thought about the archives, but anyway, we also came across a lot of issues that I don't have time to talk about. I'll come back to the first bullet in a minute, but just to say there are a lot of the issues with oral history recordings, not least in this environment. Ethical issues, problems about working in partnership, creating new digital content and problems of ownership, technological issues, cataloguing it in terms of the rest of your collections and so on. But I just briefly want to mention the first bullet, which I find particularly interesting. It's finding appropriate ways to record the memories of participants. And obviously the digital world has made access to recordings much more easy, and it's also opened up different ways that we can record things for people. Filming is more frequently used, but many people still use audio. It's easier to set up. Perhaps it's less intrusive both for the interviewer and the interviewee. And some people might even argue now that oral history is purer in the way that people aren't distracted or playing up for the camera. And even in terms of listening to it, perhaps it's purer because you're not distracted by the visuals. But to be honest, I think that's rubbish, because just as oral history recordings supplement our traditional documents, so visual recordings add something in terms of expression and so on. But with our project that Jan was talking about, we still use oral recordings mainly because it's simpler. But with the Strathmartin project, we really had to think about what it was that made the interviewees most comfortable and encourage them in different ways in which they wanted to talk about their experiences and what had happened to them. So, for example, Roddy on the left wasn't particularly happy being interviewed at the start, but he did create storyboards and memory books. Whereas Wilma on the right was straight in there with the filming. I'm going to show you a clip of Wilma that actually comes from a documentary, which is why it's subtitled and why there's music in the background. But this was her oral history recording.
I didn't go with my sister, and my mum was finding it hard to cope, and that was the only place. But my mum says if she ever knew that was for an institution, she'd never put me there. I should never have been there, because really there's nothing wrong with me.
So Wilma goes on to say she didn't know where she was going, and she was initially upset, but she quickly got used to it. She was in Strathmartin for 13 years. She actually says it was her own fault because she became institutionalised and she couldn't imagine going anywhere else. I wish I had time to talk more about the outcomes, but you might like to go and look at the Strathmartin Hospital Histories website, because one of the things that was developed was a storytelling toolkit which encourages people to explore different ways that they might be comfortable talking about themselves. Another outcome of the project was to create a documentary film, and the recording of Wilma was used in that. And I think the experience of doing this helped some who'd been initially reluctant to take part in the project. They became more comfortable talking about their experiences. The film has been edited to create a certain impact, as with any documentary, and we need to remember that. But the fact that the interviews were for a film was more understandable to some of the participants, and it made it easier for them to engage. So I'm going to play a little bit of the film. You're going to see Christopher and Bobby, who you saw before. You'll also see Heather, a member of staff, and you'll see Roddy, who is holding the memory board.
Up at the top.
Oh, you can get in. You can get in there. Oh, God.
Memories.
Oh, amazingly all right. This was nice, one thing. Oh, it's beautiful. Beautiful. Oh, it's a great big green place. There's about over 6 men, or 660 or more people in it, I don't know. So this is a dump now. The wood size, the end was wood one was long. We got older, I used to be in was 7, but before I got all these boards, I was in a bunch of what we were talking about a minute ago. But I can't say much about it because it's there. It was punching more was terrible. If you can't call your tabby, you're bunging us in a little room with a section.
So one of the key things to come out of this, and we hope we'll be able to take it forward, just to finish, is a process of reconciliation. I think we've realised that so much can come from a simple oral history project. The archives have been used in new ways. We've added to our collections, but more importantly, we've reached out to people that we wouldn't normally connect with. And even when the final outcome wasn't an oral history recording, so an oral history project without a recording, because a lot of people didn't want to take part like that, even when that was the outcome, by asking these people, we gave them a certain legitimacy, and we recognised the importance of their lives as residents and patients and staff at the hospital. We've begun to create a community of people with connections to the hospital, and we've allowed people to revisit their memories. The staff in particular hadn't felt allowed or able to remember or talk about what had happened because of the perceived stigma of them working in an asylum. So all of this has been completely unexpected, but I think there is a little bit of what we found in all of the interviews that we've done, which is why for Jen and I, taking part in these oral history projects is really worthwhile. So thank you.